Welcome to a journey through time, to a winter morning in medieval Europe, where life moved at the pace of firelight and breath, where warmth was precious and darkness was familiar. This is not a story of kings or castles, but something quieter, something slower, something that asks nothing of you except to listen and to let go. You are about to enter a peasant cottage on a cold winter morning, before the sun has risen, in that suspended time when sleep still holds the world in its gentle grip. Here, in this small dwelling, with its thick walls of mud and straw, a family rests beneath layers of wool and linen, their bodies pressed close for warmth, their breathing slow and steady in the darkness. The fire from the night before has burned down to embers, buried beneath ash, glowing faintly, like a promise that warmth will return when needed. There is no urgency here, no rush, no place you need to be, except exactly where you are. The details of this medieval morning will unfold slowly as the dawn light that begins to seep through the smoke hole in the roof. You will learn about the thickness of walls and the weight of thatch, about wool blankets and straw mattresses, about wooden bowls and clay pots, about the smell of smoke that lives in everything. But more than learning these things, you will simply be present for them, will experience them at their own natural pace, without hurry, without the need to understand or remember or do anything at all except breathe and listen and allow yourself to drift. So settle yourself now. Make yourself comfortable. Release whatever tension you might be holding, and prepare to enter this medieval winter morning, where nothing happens quickly and nothing demands your attention, except the simple unfolding of ordinary life, told at the pace of a hearth fire burning low, told with all the time in the world, told for you, to help you find your way toward rest. The winter morning arrives without announcement, without ceremony, without any particular urgency at all. There is no sudden brightness, no dramatic unveiling of the day. Instead, the light comes slowly, so slowly that you might not notice it happening if you were watching closely, which you are not, because you are simply here, present in this moment, observing the gentle transition from the deep charcoal darkness of night into the soft, muted grayness of early dawn. The sky above the village holds no color yet, just a pale, milky quality that spreads across the horizon like water seeping into fabric, gradual and inevitable, and utterly without haste. The peasant cottage sits low against the earth, its walls made of wattle and daub, that ancient mixture of woven sticks and clay and straw and dung, all pressed together and smoothed by hands that knew this work without thinking about it. The walls are thick, so thick that when you place your palm against them from the inside, you can feel how they hold the cold at bay. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but enough. Just enough to make the difference between surviving and not surviving these long winter months. The thickness of the wall is perhaps 16 inches, perhaps 18 inches. The measurement matters less than the feeling of it, the sense of mass and weight and solid presence that stands between the interior warmth and the exterior cold. The roof above slopes gently, covered in thick bundles of thatch, layer upon layer of dried reed and straw. Each bundle laid with care and overlap, so that the rain and snow will run down and away rather than seeping through. The thatch is old, several seasons old, maybe more, and it has darkened with time and weather, turning from the bright golden color of fresh harvest to a deeper brown, almost gray in places, with patches of green moss growing in the shadowed areas where moisture lingers. The weight of this thatch is considerable. Tons of dried grass pressing down upon the wooden frame. And this weight is part of what keeps the warmth inside, because the thatch is not just a barrier against rain, but also a blanket against the cold, trapping air within its countless tiny spaces between each individual stalk of grass. Inside the cottage, the darkness is still nearly complete, though not entirely, because there is a faint glow coming from the central hearth, where embers from last night's fire continue to pulse with the smallest amount of heat and light. These embers are buried beneath a layer of ash, carefully banked the night before, a technique that every peasant learns before they can walk properly. The knowledge of how to preserve fire overnight, so that in the morning there will be something to build upon rather than starting from nothing. The ash layer is thick and gray and soft as powder. And beneath it, deep beneath it, the red heart of the coals continues to breathe, slowly consuming the last of the wood that was placed there hours and hours ago. The air inside the cottage is heavy with the smell of smoke. Always smoke. Because smoke is as constant as breathing in these spaces. It lives in the walls and the roof and the packed earth floor. It clings to every surface and every piece of cloth and every strand of hair. But the smoke is not harsh or acrid. It is familiar, almost comforting. A gentle, woody scent mixed with the faint sweetness of burned grasses and the earthy undertone of peat, if peat was available, which sometimes it is, and sometimes it is not, depending on the season and the availability and the distance to the bog where such things can be cut and dried. Near the hearth, closest to the diminishing warmth, there is a sleeping platform built up from the floor, raised perhaps 12 inches, perhaps 15 inches, just high enough that the cold air that settles to the ground during the night will flow beneath rather than directly against the bodies of those who sleep there. The platform is made of rough wooden planks, likely oak or ash, whatever was available from the Lord's forest under the careful restrictions of what could be gathered. And these planks are worn smooth in places from years of use, decades perhaps, generations even, because a good sleeping platform might last the lifetime of the cottage itself. Upon this platform lies a thin mattress, though calling it a mattress might be generous. It is really more of a large sack, a very large sack sewn from rough linen or hemp cloth, and this sack is stuffed with straw, just plain wheat straw or barley straw. Whatever remained after the harvest was threshed, and the grain was separated out. The straw inside shifts and rustles with the smallest movement, making soft scratching sounds. And over time, the straw compacts and breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces, eventually almost to dust. And so the mattress must be emptied and refilled each year, usually in autumn, when fresh straw is plentiful from the recent harvest. On top of this straw mattress, there are blankets, several blankets, because winter in medieval northern Europe demands layers upon layers upon layers of anything that might hold warmth. The first blanket, the one directly against the straw, is made of rough wool, undyed wool that retains its natural gray or cream or brown color, depending on which sheep it came from. This wool has been spun into yarn by hand, someone's hands. Perhaps the woman who sleeps here, perhaps her mother, perhaps her daughter, turning the spindle hour after hour after hour until enough yarn existed to weave into cloth. The weaving itself took more hours, more days, threading the warp threads onto a simple loom and passing the shuttle back and forth, creating the interlocked structure that becomes fabric. The wool blanket is not soft, not in the way that modern minds might imagine softness. It is scratchy and coarse, and still contains bits of lanolin and natural oils from the sheep. And these oils have a smell, a distinct sheepy smell that mingles with all the other smells of the cottage. But this scratchiness, this coarseness, is not a flaw. It is simply the nature of the material. and those who sleep beneath it do not think about softness or roughness. They think only about warmth, about the way the wool fibers trap air and hold heat, about the way the blanket gets heavier and warmer as the night progresses and their body heat accumulates within it. Above the wool blanket, there is another layer, this one made of linen, older linen that has been patched many times. You can see the patches even in this dim light. Squares and rectangles of slightly different colored fabric sewn over holes and worn spots. The thread used for sewing not quite matching the original weave, but close enough, serviceable, functional. This linen blanket is thinner than the wool. It provides less warmth by itself, but it serves as a buffer between the scratchy wool and the skin. And it also helps to keep the wool cleaner, because linen can be washed more easily, though washing in winter is rare. Nearly impossible, really, because heating enough water to wash large pieces of fabric requires enormous amounts of fuel. And fuel must be saved for cooking and for the essential heating of the living space. On the very top of this pile of blankets, there is a coverlet made of small scraps of fabric. Dozens of scraps, maybe hundreds of scraps, all sewn together in no particular pattern, just pieced together wherever they fit, using every tiny remnant of cloth that was too small for any other purpose. Some of these scraps are wool, some are linen, some might be a bit of old tunic or a piece of a worn-out shift, all joined together with tiny stitches that took someone's evening hours by firelight, stitching and stitching while the light faded and the fire burned low. This coverlet is not beautiful in any aesthetic sense. It is purely practical. Another layer of warmth, another barrier against the cold that seeps through the walls and down from the roof and up from the ground. Beneath all these blankets, barely visible in the darkness, there are two human forms, a husband and a wife, both of them still sleeping, their breathing slow and deep and steady, the kind of breathing that indicates genuine rest, the body fully relaxed and trusting in sleep. They lie close together, not from any romantic notion, but from pure, practical necessity. Because two bodies generate more warmth than one body, and in winter, warmth is survival. They are fully clothed even in sleep, wearing their underlayers, their shifts and brays, because removing clothing in winter would be foolish, would waste the warmth that has built up within the fabric throughout the day. The husband lies on his back, one arm stretched out, the other resting on his chest, his hand curled loosely against the rough fabric of his shirt. His face is turned slightly to the side, toward where his wife sleeps. And his beard, which is neither particularly long nor particularly well trimmed, just allowed to grow naturally, moves slightly with each exhale, a tiny motion that catches what little light exists from the buried embers. His hair is dark, probably, though in this light, everything appears as shades of gray and black, and it lies flat against his head, pressed down by hours of lying still, with a few strands falling across his forehead in a way that suggests he has not moved much during the night. The wife lies on her side, facing toward her husband, her knees drawn up slightly in that instinctive sleeping position that conserves warmth, making the body into a smaller, more compact shape that loses less heat to the surrounding air. Her hair is completely covered by a cloth cap, a coif. Because women always cover their hair, this is simply what is done. And the cap is made of linen, yellowed with age and wear, tied under her chin with strings that have frayed at the ends. One of her hands is tucked beneath her cheek, between her face and the bundled cloth that serves as a pillow. Just a spare piece of wadded fabric, probably stuffed with more straw or perhaps wool scraps, anything soft enough to cushion the head. Between them, and also beyond them, on the sleeping platform, there are children. 3 children, ranging in age from perhaps 9 years to perhaps 3 years. Though ages are uncertain in this time and place, people do not celebrate birthdays with any regularity. They mark time by seasons and harvests and feast days, not by individual years of life. The oldest child, a girl, sleeps at the outer edge of the platform, curled into a tight ball under her own smaller blanket, her hands pulled up inside the sleeves of her shift for warmth, her shoulders hunched forward. Her breathing is soft and steady, and occasionally she makes a small sound, not quite a word, just a murmur that might be part of a dream, or simply the sound of deep sleep. The middle child, a boy, sleeps between his mother and the youngest, sprawled out in that careless way that children sleep, one arm flung wide, one leg bent, taking up more space than seems possible for such a small person. His mouth is slightly open, and he breathes through it, making the faintest whistle sound on each exhale, not loud enough to wake anyone, but present nonetheless, a small, rhythmic note in the symphony of sleeping sounds that fills the cottage. The youngest, barely more than a toddler, sleeps pressed against her mother's back, fitting into the curve of her mother's body like a spoon nested in another spoon, seeking warmth and comfort, even in unconsciousness. Her tiny hand clutches a fistful of her mother's shift, holding on even in sleep, and her breathing is faster than the adult's, the quick, light breathing of very young children, whose hearts beat faster and whose bodies burn through warmth more quickly. The packed earth floor of the cottage stretches out beyond the sleeping platform, bare and hard and cold, swept clean of debris, but still slightly uneven, with subtle dips and rises that have formed over years of use, the earth compacting more in some places than others. In the very center of this floor space sits the hearth, not a raised hearth or a contained fireplace as later centuries would build, but simply a flat area of stones arranged in a rough circle, blackened from years of fires. The stones themselves, cracked and stained and scattered with ash that has not been completely swept away. Around this central hearth, the space opens up in a rough circle, because the smoke must be able to rise upward. And directly above the hearth, high up near the peak of the roof, there is an opening, a smoke hole, which allows the smoke to escape into the outside air rather than accumulating inside until breathing becomes impossible. This smoke hole is not large, perhaps 18 inches across, perhaps 20 inches, just large enough to create draft and allow smoke to exit, but not so large that rain and snow pour directly onto the fire below. In practice, some rain always enters, and some snow, and the fire must be positioned carefully to avoid being extinguished by water falling from above. The light that is beginning to seep into the cottage comes partially through this smoke hole, a circular patch of slightly lighter gray in the darkness above, and partially through the few small gaps in the walls, places where the daub has cracked or fallen away, leaving thin lines of light that will grow brighter as the morning progresses. Though even at midday, this cottage will never be truly bright, will never be filled with sunshine, because windows with glass do not exist here, and open windows in winter would let in too much cold. Near the door, which is a simple wooden affair hung on leather hinges and currently held shut by a wooden bar laid across brackets, there are several large ceramic pots, earthenware vessels made by the village potter, or perhaps even made here by the family themselves if they have access to clay and know the technique. These pots hold various things: dried peas, perhaps, or barley grain, or flour, if they have been fortunate enough to mill some grain recently. The pots are stoppered with wooden plugs wrapped in cloth to keep out mice and rats and insects, all of which are constant companions in medieval households, unwanted but inevitable, sharing the space because they too seek warmth and food in winter. Hanging from pegs driven into the wall beams, there are various tools and implements, each one placed where it can be easily found in the darkness, because finding things by touch and memory is necessary when light is scarce. There is a wooden rake with worn tines, used for gathering hay and straw. There is a scythe with its curved blade, though it is not needed in winter, and waits patiently for spring and the first cutting of grass. There are several baskets woven from willow withes, nested inside each other to save space, used for carrying everything from eggs to vegetables to firewood. Against one wall, there is a simple wooden shelf, just rough planks laid across brackets. And on this shelf sit a few precious items. A clay oil lamp that is not currently lit because oil is expensive and used sparingly, reserved for times when work must be done after dark and firelight is insufficient. Next to the lamp, there is a small wooden box, probably containing needles and thread, and perhaps a few buttons made of bone or horn, the sewing supplies that keep clothing repaired and functional. There might also be a knife, a single knife that belongs to the household, used for cutting food and leather and rope and anything else that needs cutting. Its blade sharpened regularly on a stone that itself sits on the shelf, wrapped in a bit of cloth. The cottage has only this one room. There are no separate chambers, no private spaces. Everyone lives and sleeps and eats and works in this single circular or oval space, roughly 20 feet across at its widest point, though measurements are imprecise and vary from cottage to cottage depending on who built it and what materials were available and how many people needed to fit inside. The lack of separate rooms is not considered a hardship. It is simply how life is structured. Privacy is not a concept that matters much to people whose entire existence is communal, who work in the fields alongside dozens of others, who worship in a church where everyone can see everyone else, whose lives are visible to their neighbors at all times. As the light continues to slowly increase, individual objects within the cottage begin to emerge from the darkness, not suddenly, not with any drama, but gradually, the way shapes appear when your eyes adjust after entering a dark room from brightness. The edges of the sleeping platform become visible, the rough texture of the wooden planks, the slight gap between the platform and the wall where straw has fallen and accumulated in a small dusty pile. The curve of the ceramic pots near the door becomes apparent, their rounded bellies and narrow necks, the way they sit solid and heavy on the earth floor, unmovable unless deliberately lifted and carried. The air is cold, not brutally cold, as it would be outside, but cool enough that you can see breath if you pay attention. faint wisps of vapor with each exhale, though in the darkness these wisps are nearly invisible, more felt than seen. The temperature inside the cottage is perhaps 40 degrees, perhaps 45 degrees, using measurements that would not exist for centuries yet. But in terms of sensation, it is cold enough to make you want to stay beneath the blankets. Cold enough that the idea of getting up and moving requires a certain amount of will, a pushing past the body's desire to remain still and conserved in warmth. Outside the cottage, beyond the thick walls and the heavy door and the small gaps where light is beginning to enter, the village is equally still, equally quiet, because dawn is only just beginning, and there is no reason to rise before there is light enough to work by. The snow from previous weeks lies in uneven drifts, not deep, perhaps 6 inches in most places, less where wind has scoured it away, more where it has accumulated in sheltered spots. The snow is old snow now, not fresh and white, but grayish, packed down by feet and hooves and cartwheels, mixed with mud and straw and the inevitable debris of daily life. The village itself consists of perhaps 30 cottages, perhaps 40, scattered in no particular pattern, except that they tend to cluster near the road, such as it is, just a muddy track that connects this village to the next village several miles away. Each cottage sits on its small plot of land, with a kitchen garden area behind or beside it, though in winter this garden is just bare, frozen earth, with a few dead stalks poking through the snow, the remnants of cabbages or onions or turnips that were harvested months ago. Between the cottages, there are animal pens, rough fences of woven branches containing a pig or two, or a few chickens, or perhaps a cow, if the family is prosperous enough to own such a valuable animal. Beyond the village proper, stretching out in all directions, are the fields, the great open fields where strips of land are allocated to each family for growing grain and vegetables. These fields are empty now, covered in snow, waiting for spring, when the cycle will begin again. The plowing and sowing and tending and harvesting that defines peasant life, that determines whether there will be enough food to survive another winter. The fields are divided into strips, each family having several strips scattered throughout the different fields, rather than one large continuous plot. A system that ensures everyone shares equally in both the good soil and the poor soil, the wet areas and the dry areas, the sunny spots and the shaded spots. Back inside the cottage, time continues to pass in its slow, inexorable way, and the light continues to increase. Not rapidly, never rapidly, but steadily, the gray becoming slightly less dark, the shapes becoming slightly more defined, until eventually it becomes possible to make out colors, or rather, to make out the subtle differences in tone that indicate color. The brown of the wooden beams, the cream of the undyed wool, the dark gray of the ash around the hearth. The fire, or what remains of it, continues to breathe beneath its blanket of ash, the embers pulsing with their own internal rhythm, consuming oxygen and releasing heat, and slowly, so slowly, diminishing as the available fuel is exhausted. In perhaps an hour, perhaps 2 hours, someone will need to rise and add fresh wood to these embers, blowing gently to encourage flame, feeding the fire back to life so that warmth can spread through the cottage again, so that water can be heated for thin porridge, so that life can continue. But for now, for this extended moment, nothing is required. Nothing needs to happen. The fire sustains itself, and the people sleep on, and the morning comes without demanding anything at all. The quality of the darkness is different now than it was an hour ago. Less absolute, less complete, shot through with the faintest gray light that makes shadows possible where before there was only uniform blackness. You can see, if you look carefully, the way the thatch roof slopes downward toward the walls. The individual bundles of straw, visible as horizontal lines, layer upon layer, each bundle slightly overlapping the one below it. You can see how the walls meet the roof at an angle that is not quite precise, because precision was not possible with hand tools and eyeball measurements. Everything built by feel and experience, rather than by numbers and angles written on paper. There is a wooden beam that runs across the cottage at its widest point, a support beam that helps carry the weight of the roof. And this beam is dark with age and smoke, its surface rough and unfinished, just a tree trunk that was cut to the right length and hefted into place when the cottage was built, however many years ago that was. Hanging from this beam by a rope is a metal hook, probably iron, if iron was affordable, otherwise bronze or even wood. And this hook is used for hanging a cooking pot over the fire, though no pot hangs there now, because no cooking is happening in these pre-dawn hours. Against the far wall, barely visible in the dimness, there is a wooden chest, a simple box made of planks nailed or pegged together, with a flat lid that lifts up on leather hinges. This chest contains the family's spare clothing, the extra shift that the wife wears on Sundays and feast days, the husband's slightly less worn tunic that he saves for church, the children's outgrown garments that are being saved for the next child, or to be cut up for patches and rags. The chest also might contain a few precious items, perhaps a clay cup that is unbroken, perhaps a wooden bowl that was carved by someone with more skill than average, perhaps a handful of coins, if the family has been fortunate enough to earn or save any money. Though for most peasants, money is rare, almost theoretical, because most transactions happen through barter and exchange of goods and labor rather than currency. The husband stirs slightly in his sleep, not waking, but shifting position, his arm moving from his chest to his side, his head turning the other direction, his whole body adjusting itself unconsciously to maintain comfort, or perhaps responding to some dream that moves through his sleeping mind. The movement causes the blankets to shift slightly, disturbing the careful layering, allowing a small draft of cold air to slip in near his shoulder. And he responds by pulling the blankets more tightly around himself, all without fully waking, the body taking care of itself through instinct and habit. Beside him, the wife does not stir, remains perfectly still in her curled position, her breathing unchanged, deep and slow, her hand still tucked beneath her cheek. The youngest child, nestled against her back, makes a small sound, something between a sigh and a murmur, and her tiny fingers grip the fabric of her mother's shift more tightly for a moment before relaxing again. Sleep continues to hold them all in its grip, that necessary state of rest that allows the body to recover from the day's labor, that allows the mind to process and dream and simply stop the constant activity of consciousness. The silence in the cottage is not absolute. There are small sounds, the faint crackle of embers shifting as they collapse into ash, the tiny movements of mice in the thatch overhead, searching for seeds or insects or any tiny scrap of food, the sound of breathing from 5 different people at 5 different rhythms, creating a kind of accidental harmony. Outside, there might be the sound of wind, if wind is present, though this morning seems calm, or the distant sound of a rooster crowing from one of the village coops, announcing the coming day, even though full daylight is still some time away. Time stretches and expands in these early morning hours, each minute containing more space somehow than minutes at other times of day, because nothing is happening. Nothing is required. There is only this extended state of rest and waiting. This pause before the day begins and demands attention and labor and movement. The light continues its slow transformation from darkness to grayness to the promise of actual daylight, still far off, but approaching with the same inevitability that the seasons turn and the years pass and life continues in its ancient patterns. In this moment, in this cottage, on this winter morning, there is nothing that needs to be fixed or changed or improved. There is only the simple fact of existence, of warmth held within walls, of sleep-sustaining bodies that will soon need to wake and work, of a family together in their small circular world, protected from the cold and the darkness by nothing more than mud and straw and wool and the knowledge of how to survive that has been passed down through so many generations that no one remembers when it started or who first figured out how thick the walls needed to be, or how to bank a fire so it would last through the night. The shadows in the corners of the cottage are still deep, still holding darkness, even as the center of the room grows lighter, because light moves slowly into spaces, finding its way gradually, illuminating first the highest points, and then slowly spreading downward and outward until even the darkest corner holds at least a little bit of gray visibility. The wooden supports that hold up the roof cast long shadows across the floor, and these shadows shift almost imperceptibly as the angle of the incoming light changes with the rising sun that is still hidden below the horizon, but sending its advance light ahead like a scout, preparing the way. Near the hearth, there is a pile of firewood, just a small pile, because bringing large amounts of wood inside would take up too much valuable space. And besides, there is a larger wood pile outside, stacked against the cottage wall, where it benefits from the slight warmth that radiates through the walls, and where it stays relatively dry under the overhang of the thatch roof. This inside pile contains perhaps 10 pieces, perhaps 12. Each piece carefully selected for size and dryness, because wet wood creates too much smoke and burns poorly. And smoke that does not rise properly can fill the cottage until breathing becomes difficult and eyes water, and everyone must leave until the fire burns down or the smoke clears. Each piece of wood in this pile has a story, though no one thinks about these stories. They are too commonplace to warrant attention. This piece came from a dead branch that fell during a storm 3 weeks ago, and the husband dragged it back from the edge of the Lord's forest, where he was allowed to gather fallen wood, though cutting living trees was forbidden under pain of severe punishment. This other piece came from an old fence post that finally rotted through and needed to be replaced, the wood still sound enough at its core to burn well. This third piece might have come from a broken tool handle, or a damaged piece of furniture, or any of a dozen sources, because nothing is wasted. Everything that can burn eventually makes its way to the fire. The wood is stacked loosely, allowing air to circulate around each piece, because wood needs air to burn properly, needs oxygen to feed the chemical reaction that transforms solid matter into heat and light and ash. The bark on some pieces curls and peels, dried out from being stored inside. And this bark will catch fire quickly when placed on the embers, providing the initial flame that will spread to the denser wood beneath. Other pieces have been split with an axe, showing their inner grain, the growth rings that mark each year of the tree's life. Though again, no one thinks about this. They see only fuel, only the potential for warmth. The hearth stones themselves radiate a gentle warmth, having absorbed heat throughout the night from the fire that burned above them. And this stored warmth will last for hours, slowly dissipating into the surrounding air, contributing to the overall temperature of the cottage in a way that is subtle but significant. The stones are various sizes, some flat and broad, serving as the base on which the fire sits. Others more upright, creating a partial circle that contains the ash and helps direct the heat upward rather than allowing it to spread uselessly across the floor. These stones were collected from the fields, or from the stream bed, or from wherever stones could be found that were the right size and shape, because quarrying and cutting stone was work for specialists, for masons who built churches and castles, not for peasants building their own shelters. The surface of each stone is blackened and stained, covered in layers of soot that have accumulated over years of fires. And in some places, the stones have begun to crack from the repeated heating and cooling, the expansion and contraction that comes with each fire cycle. Eventually, these stones will break apart completely and need to be replaced. But for now, they serve their purpose, holding heat and containing fire and providing a stable surface on which to build the daily flame that makes life possible. Between the stones, in the smallest crevices and gaps, there is ash, fine gray ash that has sifted down and settled, compressed by its own weight into something almost like powder, so fine that if you were to touch it with your finger, it would feel soft and silky, leaving a gray smudge on your skin that would require washing to remove completely. This ash is the end result of combustion, the final form of wood, after all the burnable material has been consumed, leaving only the mineral content, the elements that cannot burn, silica and calcium, and various other compounds that trees pulled from the soil during their lives and concentrated in their wood. Some of this ash will eventually be collected and used for other purposes, because ash has value. It can be mixed with water and animal fat to make a crude soap. or it can be scattered in the garden to improve the soil, adding minerals that plants need to grow. Or it can be saved and sold, or traded to someone who makes lye for more sophisticated soap making, or for use in tanning leather. But most of the ash simply accumulates, layer upon layer, until the hearth area becomes raised slightly above the surrounding floor. And then someone will shovel it out and carry it away, spreading it somewhere useful. And the process will begin again. The wife's breathing changes slightly, becoming a bit less deep, a bit more variable. The first sign that she is beginning to transition from deep sleep toward wakefulness, though she has not yet opened her eyes or moved beyond the small adjustments that sleeping bodies make continuously throughout the night. Her mind is starting to process the information that her senses provide. The coolness of the air on her face, the warmth of the child pressed against her back, the familiar smells of smoke and wool, and the general mustiness that comes from living in a small, enclosed space with several other people and no real ventilation beyond the smoke hole. Her hand, the one tucked under her cheek, flexes slightly, fingers straightening and then curling again, testing the world through small movements before committing to full wakefulness. This is the way most mornings begin, not with sudden alertness, but with this gradual surfacing from sleep, the mind and body slowly remembering where they are, and what day it is, and what needs to be done. In summer, the bird song would help with this waking process. The chorus of dawn birds announcing the day with such insistence that sleep becomes impossible. But in winter, the birds are fewer and quieter, and waking must happen through internal mechanisms, through the body's own sense of when rest has been sufficient and activity must begin. The husband, still deeply asleep, has begun to snore very softly, not the loud, rattling snore that some men produce, but a gentle, rhythmic sound that happens only when he is lying on his back in a particular position with his mouth slightly open. The sound is barely audible, more of a vibration than a noise, but it is enough that if you were lying next to him, you would be aware of it, would feel it as much as hear it. His beard moves slightly with each exhale, the coarse hairs fluttering in the small current of air from his breath, and his chest rises and falls in the slow, steady rhythm that indicates he is still far from waking, still deep in whatever dreams occupy his sleeping mind. The oldest child, the girl sleeping at the edge of the platform, shifts position without waking, rolling from her tightly curled ball onto her back, one arm flung out beyond the edge of the platform, dangling in the cold air. Her blanket has slipped down slightly, exposing her shoulder and upper arm. And even in sleep, her body recognizes the increased cold, trying to curl back into a warmer position. But the movement is incomplete, abandoned halfway through as sleep maintains its hold. Her face, barely visible in the dim light, is relaxed and peaceful, the smooth, unlined face of childhood, unmarked by the years of labor and worry that will eventually carve lines and creases into her features as she grows into adulthood and takes on the responsibilities and hardships of peasant life. Outside the cottage, the village is beginning to stir, not with any sudden activity, but with the same gradual waking that is happening inside each dwelling. In the cottage next door, which shares a wall with this one, someone is already awake. You can hear the faint sounds through the thick barrier of wattle and daub, the soft footsteps on packed earth, the quiet sounds of someone trying to move without waking others, the gentle scraping sound of a wooden bar being lifted from door brackets. These sounds are muffled almost to inaudibility, but they exist, small reminders that this cottage is not alone in the world, that other families are going through the same morning rituals. Other fires will soon be rebuilt. Other thin porridges will be cooked and eaten. The light coming through the smoke hole is noticeably brighter now, no longer just a pale gray, but beginning to take on the faintest hint of color. A slight warmth in the tone that suggests the sun, though still hidden below the horizon, is getting closer to rising. This light falls in a circular pattern on the floor near the hearth, illuminating the ash and the nearest stones, creating a pool of visibility in the center of the cottage, while the walls and corners remain relatively dark. Dust motes float in this shaft of light, tiny particles of ash and fiber and dried skin, and all the various microscopic debris that fills the air of any human dwelling, made visible only when light passes through them at the right angle. The roof beam, the main support running across the cottage, is now clearly visible, and you can see the grain of the wood, the way the growth pattern created long lines that run the length of the beam, slightly spiral in some places, slightly irregular in others, because trees do not grow perfectly straight. They twist and bend in response to wind and sun and the competition with other trees for light and space. The surface of the beam is rough, showing the marks of the axe that shaped it, shallow indentations and ridges where the blade cut into the wood, removing material bit by bit until the tree trunk became a usable beam of the right size and proportions. Hanging from this beam, in addition to the iron hook for the cooking pot, there are several bundles of dried herbs, tied together with twine and suspended upside down so that any moisture remaining in them will drain downward and out rather than accumulating and causing rot. These herbs were gathered last autumn before the first frost killed them, and they hang here slowly drying, slowly releasing their aromatic oils into the air of the cottage, contributing to the complex smell that defines this space. There might be bundles of sage or thyme or rosemary, if rosemary grows in this particular region, or any of the various plants that have medicinal or culinary uses that can be crumbled into soup to add flavor, or steeped in hot water to make a tea for stomach ailments or respiratory complaints. The herbs are brown now, their green color faded and darkened through the drying process, and their leaves are brittle, ready to crumble at the slightest touch. Some of the bundles have been here since autumn. Others might be older, carried over from the previous year, if the harvest was particularly abundant, or if illness was less frequent than usual, and fewer herbs were needed for remedies. The twine that binds them is rough hemp or flax cordage, hand-twisted from plant fibers, the same kind of cordage that is used for 1,000 purposes around the cottage and the village, from tying bundles of firewood to lashing together fence rails to creating the web of ropes that help secure the thatch to the roof frame. The wife's eyes open, just slightly, just enough to let in the dim light and begin to orient herself to the world of wakefulness. She does not move otherwise, does not disturb the careful arrangement of blankets and bodies that has maintained warmth through the night. But her eyes are now open, looking at the familiar interior of the cottage, seeing the beam overhead, seeing the faint light from the smoke hole, seeing her husband's profile beside her, still deep in sleep. She blinks slowly, once, twice, allowing her eyes to adjust and her mind to fully emerge from the fog of dreams. For a moment, she simply lies still, taking in the sensations of the morning, the cold air on her face, the warmth of her daughter's small body pressed against her back, the slight ache in her shoulder from lying in one position for too many hours, the knowledge that soon, very soon, she will need to rise and begin the day's work. But for this moment, this brief moment, she can simply be, can exist in the space between sleep and full waking, not quite required to act yet. This is perhaps the only time of day when such stillness is possible, because once the day truly begins, there will be no rest, no pause, only the constant round of tasks that must be completed to keep the household functioning, to keep everyone fed and warm and alive through another day of winter. Her mind runs through the tasks ahead without conscious effort, a mental list that has been the same for so many years that it requires no actual thought. Fetching water from the well, rebuilding the fire, cooking porridge, feeding the chickens. If the chickens have survived the night, and the foxes, checking on the pig, spinning wool if there is daylight enough, mending clothes if something needs mending, preparing the evening meal, banking the fire again for the night. The tasks repeat in an endless cycle, day after day, week after week, month after month, varying only slightly with the seasons. Slightly more work in summer, when the garden needs tending and the harvest demands long hours. Slightly less in winter, when darkness limits the working day and there is simply less that can be done. She shifts slightly, carefully, trying not to wake the child behind her, and the movement causes the blankets to slide a tiny bit, allowing cold air to seep in along her side. She immediately adjusts, pulling the blankets more securely around herself, trapping the warmth before too much is lost. This constant management of warmth is so habitual that it happens without thought, an automatic response to the sensation of cold, refined through years of practice, until it becomes as natural as breathing. The motion causes her husband to stir slightly, a small sound in his throat, a shift of his arm. But he does not wake, continues sleeping while she lies there, gathering the will to leave the warmth and begin the day. The middle child, the boy, makes a sudden movement in his sleep, his leg kicking out under the blankets, his arm flailing slightly, and he makes a sound, not quite a word, but a vocalization that suggests he is dreaming something active, some dream of running or playing or doing whatever it is that occupies the dreams of 7-year-old peasant boys. The movement disturbs the youngest child, who whimpers softly, a small sound of complaint. But both children settle again almost immediately, sinking back into deeper sleep, their bodies relaxing, their breathing returning to the slow, steady rhythm of genuine rest. The wife watches this small drama unfold, her mother's instinct attuned to every sound and movement her children make, even when she is not fully awake, ready to respond if genuine need arises, but able to distinguish between the small disturbances of normal sleep and the sounds that indicate real problems. She knows the difference between her daughter's hungry cry and her frightened cry, between her son's nightmare sounds and his sounds of illness, knows these things with a certainty that requires no analysis. The knowledge built into her body through years of constant attention and care. The hearth embers have dimmed further during the night. The glow beneath the ash now barely visible even in the darkness of the cottage. Just the faintest hint of orange red deep in the gray powder, like a secret being kept, like a promise that fire still exists, even though it cannot be seen clearly. Soon, perhaps within the next quarter hour, perhaps within the next half hour, the wife will need to rise and tend to these embers, will need to carefully push aside the ash and expose the coals to air, will need to add the smallest pieces of kindling, dry straw, or thin twigs that will catch quickly, and then blow gently to provide the oxygen that will transform dormant embers into active flame. This process of fire tending is one she has performed thousands of times, perhaps tens of thousands of times, every morning of her adult life and many mornings of her childhood, helping her mother before she had her own household, learning through observation and practice the delicate balance required to bring a fire back to life without smothering it or allowing it to go completely cold. The technique is simple, but requires attention. You must add air without adding too much, must add fuel without adding too much, must be patient and allow the fire to grow at its own pace rather than trying to rush it. Because rushed fires often fail, and a failed fire means starting completely from scratch, means finding the fire steel and flint and char cloth and going through the much longer process of striking sparks and catching them and nursing them into flame. The door of the cottage faces roughly east, though again, precise directions are not something peasants think about or need to know. And this means that as the sun rises, if there were windows, they would begin to admit direct sunlight. But there are no windows, only the small gaps and cracks in the walls where the daub has deteriorated, and these admit only the smallest threads of light, nothing that could truly illuminate the interior. The smoke hole provides most of the light, and as the sky outside grows brighter, the light falling through this opening intensifies, spreading wider, reaching further into the corners of the cottage, revealing more details of the space. You can see now the wooden bowls stacked near the hearth, 4 bowls of slightly different sizes, carved from single pieces of wood by someone with more skill than average, each bowl worn smooth from years of use, years of holding porridge and stew and whatever other foods have been cooked in this household. The bowls are not decorated, not painted, or carved with designs. They are purely functional objects, shaped to hold food and nothing more. But there is a certain beauty in their simplicity, in the clean curves of their interiors, in the way they fit one inside the other for storage, in the dark color the wood has acquired from absorbing oils and liquids over time. Next to the bowls, there are several wooden spoons, also hand-carved, their handles worn thin in places from being gripped by hands day after day, meal after meal. The spoons are different sizes, adult spoons and smaller spoons for the children. And one of the adult spoons has a crack running partway up the handle, a weakness that will eventually cause it to break. But for now, it still functions, and so it continues to be used because making or acquiring a new spoon requires time and effort, or trade goods. And as long as the old spoon works, there is no urgency to replace it. The wife takes a breath, a deeper breath than her sleeping breathing, a breath that signals decision, the moment when she commits to waking fully and rising and beginning the day. She does not move yet, but the breath itself is a transition, a line crossed. And now, it is only a matter of seconds or minutes before she will push aside the blankets and expose herself to the cold air and swing her legs off the sleeping platform and place her feet on the packed earth floor. She has done this countless times. Every morning of every day of every year since she became responsible for maintaining a household. And yet it never becomes easy. The transition from warmth to cold, from rest to labor. The body always protests slightly, always prefers to remain in the comfortable state rather than moving into discomfort. But discipline and habit and necessity are stronger than preference. And so she prepares herself mentally for the movement, for the shock of cold air, for the stiffness in her joints that always comes after hours of immobility, for the way her muscles will ache until she has moved around enough to warm them and loosen them. She knows that once she is up and moving, once the fire is rebuilt and the cottage begins to warm, once she has some food in her stomach, the discomfort will fade, and she will settle into the rhythm of the day. But this knowledge does not make the actual getting up any easier. The light continues to grow, imperceptibly, moment by moment, but noticeably when compared across minutes. The progression from deep gray to lighter gray to the kind of gray that suggests white might be possible eventually, when the sun finally clears the horizon and its direct light reaches the village. The snow outside will help with this brightening, reflecting whatever light exists and amplifying it slightly, making winter days brighter than they would be otherwise, despite the sun's low angle and reduced strength during these shortest days of the year. Inside the cottage, the temperature has dropped slightly during the night, as the fire diminished and the stored heat in the walls and floor dissipated into the outside cold, and it will drop further in the next hour as the last of the ember's warmth fails. And then it will begin to rise again as the fire is rebuilt and begins to heat the space. This daily temperature cycle is as predictable as sunrise and sunset, as inevitable as the seasons. The cottage breathing in rhythm with the fire, warm when the fire is strong, cool when the fire is weak, never truly hot, never truly cold, existing in a middle range that is bearable if you are dressed appropriately and have sufficient blankets at night. The wife finally moves, a small movement first, just pulling her hand out from under her cheek and flexing her fingers, testing how cold the air is, how much she will need to brace herself against the temperature change. Her fingers are stiff from being curled in the same position for hours, and she works them carefully, bending each joint, feeling the small pops and creaks that come from cartilage and tendons moving after long stillness. The air on her hand is noticeably cold, cold enough that she can feel her skin temperature dropping within seconds, cold enough that she knows the transition will be unpleasant, but not unbearable. She takes another deep breath, and then, with a movement that is both sudden and practiced, she pushes the blankets aside and swings her legs off the platform, her feet finding the floor without needing to look, knowing from habit exactly how far down the ground is, exactly where to place her feet to avoid the child's toys or the tools or any other obstacle that might be on the floor in this area. The cold air hits her immediately, a wave of chill that makes her skin contract and her muscles tighten. But she does not pause, does not allow herself to hesitate, because hesitation would make it harder, would give her body time to protest and try to convince her to return to the warmth. Instead, she stands, her posture slightly hunched because the roof slopes downward here near the wall, and full height is not possible except in the center of the cottage. And she reaches for the heavy wool shawl that hangs on a peg near the sleeping platform, wrapping it around her shoulders over her shift, adding another layer of warmth, another barrier against the cold. The shawl is thick and scratchy and familiar, one of the first things she reaches for every morning, and its weight on her shoulders is comforting, a small protection against the world. Behind her, the youngest child makes a small sound, feeling the absence of her mother's warmth. And the wife turns back, quickly, quietly, and tucks the blankets more securely around the child, filling the space where her own body had been with folded fabric, providing substitute warmth until the cottage can be heated enough that the children can rise without suffering. The child settles immediately, sinking back into deep sleep, unaware that her mother has left, secure in the cocoon of blankets and straw mattress, and the warmth of her siblings nearby. The wife moves toward the hearth, her feet making almost no sound on the packed earth floor, moving through the semi-darkness with the confidence of someone who knows every inch of this space, who could navigate it blindfolded if necessary. She kneels beside the hearth, feeling the slight warmth of the stones even through the fabric of her shift. And she reaches for the small pile of kindling that sits always ready beside the hearth. Dry twigs and straw and small splinters of wood, carefully prepared and kept dry specifically for this purpose, for bringing the fire back to life each morning. She pauses for a moment, still kneeling, and looks at the ash-covered embers, trying to judge whether enough heat remains to revive the fire, or whether she will need to start completely fresh. This judgment is important because it determines how long the process will take, how much effort will be required, whether she can have warmth and the ability to cook breakfast within a quarter hour, or whether it will take longer, require more work, more patience. She leans closer, looking for the faint glow of red beneath the gray, looking for any sign that living coals still exist under the ash blanket. There, yes, there is a faint glow, barely visible but present, a tiny area of orange-red showing through where the ash is thinner, and she feels a small surge of satisfaction, of relief, because this means the fire has survived the night, means her careful banking yesterday evening was successful, means she can work with what exists rather than starting from nothing. She reaches out with one hand, slowly, carefully, and begins to push aside the ash, not roughly, but gently, revealing more of the buried coals, exposing them to air, while being careful not to smother them with too much disturbance of the surrounding ash. The coals, exposed to air and attention, seem to respond, their glow intensifying slightly, becoming more visible, more present. And she knows she has succeeded, knows that fire still lives here and can be coaxed back into open flame with patience and proper technique. She selects a few pieces of the driest straw from the kindling pile, just a small handful, and lays these carefully on the exposed coals, positioning them so they make contact with the heat, but also allow air to circulate around them. And then she leans forward and blows, gently, steadily, a long, slow exhale that provides oxygen without creating so much wind that the coals are cooled or the ash is scattered everywhere. The straw begins to smoke, thin gray smoke rising up. And then, after several seconds of steady blowing, a small orange flame appears, tiny but real, licking up from the straw where it contacts the coal. And this flame is the beginning, the seed from which the day's fire will grow. She adds more straw immediately, feeding the flame while it is still small and vulnerable, and continues blowing, providing the steady stream of oxygen that fire needs to exist and grow. And the flame spreads through the straw, consuming it quickly, creating more heat, more light, establishing itself as a living thing within the dead ash and cold stones. Now she adds small twigs, the thinnest pieces from the kindling pile, no thicker than her smallest finger, brittle wood that will catch easily from the straw flames. She positions these carefully, building a small structure that allows air to flow through while providing enough fuel to sustain and grow the flame. And as she works, her hands move with practiced efficiency. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Every action the result of experience and repetition. The twigs catch, small flames running along their length, and the fire is growing now, no longer tentative, but beginning to establish itself, beginning to generate real heat that she can feel on her face and hands. The sound of the fire is soft, a gentle crackling as the wood burns, releasing gases that ignite and pop, creating the characteristic sound that humans have been listening to for hundreds of thousands of years, since long before there were cottages or villages or agriculture, back when fire was captured from lightning strikes and jealously guarded, because starting a new fire from scratch was difficult and uncertain. But this fire needs no such guarding now. It is growing reliably, fed with good dry fuel, tended by experienced hands, and within minutes it will be strong enough to accept larger pieces of wood, the thumb-thick branches and split logs that will burn for hours and provide the sustained heat needed to warm the cottage and cook food. She sits back on her heels, still watching the fire, but no longer actively tending it for the moment, allowing it to establish itself, to grow strong enough that adding more fuel will not smother it. The light from the flames is brighter than the gray dawn light coming through the smoke hole, casting dancing shadows on the walls and roof, making the cottage interior seem to flicker and move, alive with light and shadow. The warmth is beginning to spread, not dramatically, not enough to heat the entire cottage yet, but enough that her face and hands, closest to the flames, feel noticeably warmer, feel the pleasant sensation of cold skin being heated, blood vessels dilating, sensation returning to fingers that had been slightly numb from the morning cold. Behind her, she hears movement from the sleeping platform, and she turns to see her husband stirring, his arm moving, his head turning, the small motions that indicate he too is beginning to wake. She does not speak to him, does not greet him, or announce that she is awake and working, because speaking is not necessary. The activity itself is communication enough. The light and sound of the fire tell him everything he needs to know about what is happening. He will wake in his own time, will rise when he is ready, and together they will move through the morning routine that structures every day of their lives. She turns back to the fire, judges that it is ready for more fuel, and selects several larger pieces from the indoor woodpile, each piece perhaps 2 inches in diameter, split sections of larger branches, and she lays these carefully on the growing flames, not all at once, which would risk smothering the fire, but one at a time, allowing each piece to catch before adding the next. The fire accepts each addition, flames wrapping around the new wood, heat beginning to penetrate the denser material, starting the process of combustion that will transform this solid wood into heat and light and ash. The cottage is noticeably brighter now, the firelight competing with and perhaps exceeding the dawn light from outside, and she can see clearly the details that were obscured earlier, the texture of the walls, the shapes of hanging objects, the features of her husband's face as he lies there, slowly transitioning from sleep to wakefulness. The smoke from the fire rises upward, drawn by the draft created by the smoke hole, and most of it exits through that opening, though some spreads through the cottage interior, adding to the ever-present layer of smoke smell that permeates everything. She stands, her knees stiff from kneeling on the hard floor, and moves toward the wooden shelf where the clay water jug sits, because before anything else can happen, before breakfast can be prepared, water is needed. The jug is large, perhaps 2 gallons, made of thick clay that keeps the water relatively cool even in summer and prevents it from freezing completely in winter when kept inside the cottage. She lifts the jug, feeling its weight, judging how much water remains, and decides there is enough for immediate needs, but that she will need to fetch more from the village well later in the morning, after the sun is up and the day is fully begun. She pours water from the jug into a smaller clay pot, the cooking pot that will hang over the fire, filling it perhaps halfway, enough for a thin porridge for the family. The water makes a soft gurgling sound as it pours, a pleasant domestic sound that is part of the morning soundtrack, along with the crackling fire and the gradual stirring of her family as they wake. She carries the pot to the hearth and positions it carefully on the stones near the fire. Not directly in the flames, yet, but close enough to begin warming. Because cold water must be heated gradually, or the pot might crack from thermal shock. The clay unable to handle rapid temperature changes. While the water begins its slow warming, she returns to the shelf and finds the small ceramic jar that contains oats, rough crushed oats that were ground at the village mill several weeks ago when the mill stream had enough water flow to turn the wheel. The oats are coarse, not finely ground like flour, but broken into pieces, each grain crushed, but still retaining some texture. And this coarseness means they will cook into a porridge that has body, that has something to chew, rather than dissolving completely into mush. She measures out several handfuls, using her cupped palm as a measure, knowing from experience how much is needed to feed 5 people a morning meal that will sustain them through several hours of work. She adds the oats to the warming water, stirring with a wooden spoon, watching as the dry grains absorb moisture and begin to soften and swell. This porridge will cook for perhaps half an hour, perhaps longer, simmering gently over the fire, stirred occasionally to prevent sticking and burning, thickening gradually as the oats release their starch and create a creamy consistency. It is not exciting food, not varied or flavorful, just oats and water, and perhaps a small pinch of salt, if salt is available. But it is filling. It provides energy. It keeps hunger at bay until the midday meal. And that is sufficient. That is all that is needed. The husband sits up on the sleeping platform, slowly, moving carefully to avoid waking the children who still sleep. And he runs his hand through his hair, pushing it back from his face, and then rubs his eyes. The gestures of waking that every human makes, the body's way of transitioning from the stillness of sleep to the readiness of waking. He looks toward his wife, sees her at the hearth tending the porridge, and nods. A small acknowledgement, a wordless communication that says he sees her, sees that the day has begun, sees that the work is underway. He reaches for his own outer tunic, the heavy wool garment that hangs on a peg near the sleeping platform, and pulls it on over his undershift, adding layers, preparing himself for the cold of the day. He swings his legs off the platform and stands, stretching carefully in the limited space, feeling his back crack and pop as the vertebrae adjust after hours of lying in one position. He is perhaps 30 years old, perhaps 35, though again precise age is uncertain, and his body already shows the wear of constant labor, the slightly bent posture of someone who spends hours each day bent over a hoe or scythe. The roughness of his hands from handling tools and ropes and rough materials. The lines beginning to form on his face from years of sun and wind and the general hardship of life. He moves toward the door, lifts the wooden bar that secures it, and pushes it open, allowing the cold morning air to rush in, and steps outside to relieve himself, because this is part of the morning routine. The necessary biological functions that must be attended to before the day can truly begin. The door remains open while he is out, and the cold air floods into the cottage, chilling everything it touches. But this is brief. He will return within moments and close the door again, and the fire is strong enough now that the cottage will quickly warm again after this intrusion. The wife continues stirring the porridge, watching as it begins to bubble slightly, the heat penetrating through the water and starting to cook the oats, transforming them from hard grains into edible food. She adds another small piece of wood to the fire, maintaining the heat, keeping the fire at the level needed for cooking without letting it die down, or building it so high that the porridge cooks too quickly and risks burning. This constant attention to the fire, this continuous management of heat, is so ingrained in her that she does it without conscious thought, the way someone might breathe or blink, an automatic process that requires no mental effort. The husband returns, closes the door, replaces the bar, and comes to stand near the fire, warming his hands, rubbing them together, bringing circulation back to fingers that have become cold from just the brief exposure to the outdoor air. He and his wife exchange no words. There is no need for conversation. They know what needs to be done, know the pattern of the morning, and they move through it together in comfortable swag, each attending to their own tasks in the shared rhythm of household maintenance that has been refined over years of living together, of working together, of building a life in this small, circular space. The porridge bubbles more actively now, and she stirs it again, scraping the bottom of the pot to ensure nothing is sticking and burning. And she can see that the consistency is changing, the liquid becoming thicker, the oats swelling and beginning to break apart, releasing their starch into the water and creating the creamy texture that characterizes properly cooked porridge. The smell of cooking grain fills the cottage, not an exciting smell, not something that makes the mouth water with anticipation, but a comforting smell nonetheless. The smell of food being prepared, the smell of sustenance, the smell that says the day has truly begun and the family will be fed. The light outside is continuing to grow, the gray becoming lighter, taking on a slight yellowish tint that suggests the sun is very close to rising, perhaps already clearing the horizon, though not yet visible from this particular angle, not yet sending its direct rays into the village. The smoke hole shows a circle of pale sky, and through the cracks in the walls, thin lines of brighter light are beginning to penetrate, creating patterns on the interior surfaces, diagonal stripes and geometric shapes that shift and change as the angle of the sunlight changes with the sun's slow progress across the sky. But you are no longer watching. You are drifting now, slipping away from this medieval morning, from the details of wooden bowls and wool blankets, from the smell of smoke and the weight of thatch overhead. The story continues without you, as it should, because you came here to rest, not to see how it ends. The cottage fades. The fire burns low in your mind. Your breathing has slowed to match the sleeping children. Sleep now, deep and dreamless. The medieval world releases you. Sleep.